you born?
I was born in the Stanley County Memorial Hospital in Albemarle, North Carolina.
Okay. How long did you live there?
Albemarle is about 10 miles from a little town called Norwood, which is to the south, near the forks of the river where the Yadkin River joins up with the PD. Strike that. The Yadkin River joins up with the Rocky to form the Great PD. And the little town of Norwood is the community I lived in. I lived there all my life, from birth till I went to college at ASU in Boone.
Why did you move to North Carolina?
To Lenoir, North Carolina?
Yeah.
Why did I move to Lenoir? I did my undergraduate degree, the 4 years in history at ASU. And then when that was over with, I was a governess for a year for a professor's family. And then I went back to graduate school and got a master's degree in reading education. So the year that I graduated from graduate school, 5 or 6 in my graduating class were hired to be reading teachers in the Title I program in Caldwell County. So we all came to Lenoir together in August of 1977.
What is your fondest memory of your father?
My fondest memory of my father is the times that we would go to historical sites. He loved history and he loved the water. He was a Navy man, and we sailed a lot around the Chesapeake Bay, the James River, the York River, as far up as the Potomac. And sometimes we'd fish and sometimes we would just sail, just for the fun of going places. But as we would go to those areas, we would always try to take in the historical areas.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of them there in that cradle of the Virginia colony. So we did a good bit of looking around places like Williamsburg, Jamestown, and Yorktown.
What is your fondest memory of your mother?
After I had been teaching at Valmead for a few years, she came and visited for a while, about a month. And she had wanted to come to school with me. And it was about the time that the frog program started. She was so fascinated by it. And I remember teaching a lesson and looking over and seeing her just beam like she was the happiest human on earth. And I could see the pride and the happiness in her eyes that I'd given her just by what I was doing. And it left such an indelible image on my memory that she was, she always loved to read herself, so there I was teaching people to read, and that was amazing to her.
Who was your best friend as a child?
My double second cousin, Shirley. The Parkers in Norwood, the Parkers started in Anson County, which is across the Rocky River to the south of Stanley County, in Anson County. But after my great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, John Benton Parker, when he left the Civil War, he and his brother Francis were the only 2 of the cousins that had survived the war. And they came back to Anson and married their sweethearts, and they moved across the river to that area near Norwood. And we were there, they were in that area. So then basically around Norwood since 1866, something like that. So we were, they married into certain families, like families always do. And the Parker family married extensively into the Melton family. So 2 of the Parker boys, Columbus, Algie, and Ray, and his sister Alma, married 3 of the Melton children, Ella, and my grandmother, Mary Annie, and her brother Pinckney. So my best friend was my double second cousin. Her aunt and my grandmother were sisters. And her grandfather and my grandfather were brothers. And we were talking about the genetics one time, and when you're related that way, when you have multiple families marrying into the same family, what you end up with are people who look more alike than their own siblings do. For example, the year I was born, 1952, there were 3 pregnancies. The first 2 pregnancies brought forth twins, girl-boy twins, Shirley and her brother Billy, and Mike and his twin sister Pat. I look more like Mike than his twin looked like him. But it's because of the interrelationship of those 2 families that the genetics were strong through there. Very, very supportive families, and of course they lived near each other. The 2 plantations were side by side. So, in those days, you didn't venture far from home to find a bride. So you married who you had close by. And the Parkers had the Melton children, and vice versa. The Meltons had the Parker children. So my double second cousin was my best friend.
Yeah. Have you ever met anyone that is famous?
We've talked about this before. And I have to give some background information before I even tell you about the famous part. When I was 4, about 4 and a half, the age Stella is now, my brother David, the middle child in the family, Jeff hadn't been born yet. David had respiratory problems, and in those days they would burn something they called a creosote oil lamp that would, you would inhale the smells that it put in the room, and it helped breathing. It was a form of a breathing treatment that they used, and they don't use it anymore because of the creosote. It has its own issues. But our maid had put our coloring books under the oil lamp and had put us to bed, and we were supposedly down, but we weren't down. We were going to color. Well, timed the same way in those years, air conditioning wasn't as prevalent as it is today. So you had to have screens on the windows so you could have ventilation at night on those hot Piedmont southern nights. My grandfather would once a year, since he was the master carpenter, he would take down all the screens and rescreen everything, make everything nice and tight, and bugs or any animal couldn't get through. He had taken all the screens down. My parents were having a picnic, kind of, I guess maybe a patio party, what you would call it today, in the backyard. I grabbed the coloring books, I yanked it, the lamp fell over, it broke, the oil spilled down my pajamas, caught on fire. I remember it vividly. I don't remember any pain. I remember the fire, and I remember thinking, oh, this is bad. I knew it was bad. And I remember that awful, horrible, and this I did not mention to you last time, but the look on my brother's face. He wanted to scream. He would have been 2 and a half, something like that. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. And then I hear a noise, and the noise is my dad jumping through the window, which he could do readily because the screens were off of it. The window was up. He jumped in the window, and in one fell swoop, grabbed the blanket, wrapped me in it. I passed out, and I went into a coma for a little over 2 weeks. They were pretty sure that I would not make it. They'd already made preliminary funeral arrangements. I was badly burned. I was in a burn center in Charlotte, at Presbyterian Hospital, for those 2 weeks. But one night, I woke up, and other than being hungry, I was fine. And now, there are places on me where you can tell where I was so severely burned. But it had weakened my body because it took me a while to get over that trauma of almost dying. So all the doctors suggested that my mother's father and mother Pawpaw Hester and Granny Hester, should raise me. Mom and Dad and David, and she was about that same time pregnant with Jeff, they went on to Virginia to take a job there. I stayed back on the farm with my grandparents, and that's where I lived for the rest of my days. And when my grandfather got sick, it was important for me to be there because I could run the farm and did run the farm. But in the summers, I would go to Virginia when we had Christmas holidays, Easter holidays, any big span of time where we could go the 300 miles to get to the peninsula, Tidewater, Virginia, around Hampton. Went there, and my dad and my Uncle Barney, that would be Daddy's sister Ruth, married Barney Turner. Dad and Barney owned a series of service stations and garages and fix-all establishments. And they just happened to be adjacent. One was at one of the entrances to Langley Air Force Base and NASA. And the other one was at the main entrance, and that was Dad's station. And so that was about the time that the Mercury astronauts started their program. And NASA was there. It was long before there was a manned space center in Houston. It was, if you were talking rocket science, you were at Langley. So these astronauts and pilots, they were pilots. It was right before they were training to be astronauts. They weren't given extra money for that very dangerous duty. So most of them had wives and children, and they were living on a very meager Air Force salary. So what they did was the ones that needed income would get jobs. And a convenient place to get a job was at a garage adjacent to the gate to the base. It was like a half a mile from where they lived. So working for Daddy, there were more than the ones I've mentioned to you before, because my brother and I had to talk about this the other day, and he says, "Oh, you have forgotten who else worked there." The ones I remember the most clearly are Gus Grissom, who was the one that was so dear to me, and Wallace Schirra. My brother reminded me about Schirra. I'd forgotten about him. Scott Carpenter I remembered clearly. Those three worked for Daddy. So they were in and out of my life. In fact, Gus Grissom used to say that when he grew up, he would marry me. He was one of those jokers. He would let a kid. Of course, he had a wife and children of his own. And I was like in 4th or 5th grade. I was little. But because of this association with the Mercury astronauts, almost all the rocket scientists were in and out of the station. Most of them ran an account, and they would, buy their gas every week. Whenever they needed anything, need a car fixed, bring them there. And then at the end of that time, at the end of the month, they would pay their bill. So we knew Werner von Braun very clearly, arguably the most famous rocket scientist that ever lived. We know he's the father of NASA as we know it. There would have been no space exploration if it weren't for him. My dad's best friend was his personal assistant, Dr. Ina Matson. I met Fermi. If in the world of rocket science and nuclear physics, those people were in and out of my life. I didn't think I realized at the time just how important they were, but I did greatly dislike Dr. von Braun. Someone had told me he was a Nazi, and I made it my business to go to the library and look that up. Even though I was very young, I was one of those people that had to know, just like I do now. I want to know. So when I realized his close association with Hitler, from that point on, I had nothing to do with him. And he wanted me to be his friend. He would go, "Little girl, what are you reading?" And I would just, sometimes I would be rather, I wanted him to leave me alone. Yeah. And I didn't quite know how to say, "Just leave me alone, I'm not interested in you." So then I would get what you or your mother or most anyone else would say, a little snooty to him. And I remember one time I was reading a book about Molly Pitcher, the Revolutionary War heroine. And he asked me Dr. von Braun asked me what I was reading. And I said, "Nuclear physics." And he laughed. Well, my father felt I was being very snide to him. So I was punished quite clearly because Dr. Von Braun was a very good paying customer, even if he was a possible war criminal and chief of NASA. But those NASA folks were in and out. We knew Chris Kraft. If they were a Gemini astronaut, they either bought gas from Daddy or they ran an account there. Many times John Glenn would come in and I would take his monthly he'd pay his bill and I would write him his receipt. I remember one time he told me that I had beautiful handwriting for a fourth grader. And like I say, I didn't realize until later truly how important these people were to American history until after the fact. But to this day, whenever, in fact recently on the History Channel, they showed Gus walking to the capsule, and he burns to death in it. And he was so dear because his wife, when he and his wife would go on dates, their children would come to our house and we would babysit them. So these would be considered really he was the closest one. Dr. Von Braun, I didn't want to be close to him. I felt like once I realized that Peenemünde existed, and that was of course where he built his rockets for Hitler, the ones that were pointed directly at London, the ones that wreaked havoc during the Blitzkrieg. So much death and destruction came at his hands. I didn't want any dealings with him. I think all my life, I felt like I needed to take the high moral ground, what was the right thing to do, and it didn't seem the right thing to do to have an association with a man that was directly implicated in so many Jews losing their lives for absolutely nothing other than the fact that they were born Jews. And I couldn't forgive him for it. Be that right, be that wrong, in the mind of a child, that's sort of how I felt about him. So I would say others have come through, other fairly famous folks have come through. And through my genealogy on several sides of my family, I'm related to Thomas Jefferson. My 9th great-grandfather was godfather to Martha Dandridge, who became Martha Washington. So there's people in and out of my family that in American history were fairly famous. But as far as direct contact, I would say the NASA program before it moved to Texas. Yeah. Those folks. I'm sorry I talked so long on that.
That's fine.
You almost have to give the background, though. I wouldn't have been there as much if it weren't for that fire. And the fire leaving me with my grandparents forced me to be almost more grown up than my age. I know my Uncle Bill, the day I married Richard, he said to me, now you go on and have a childhood. Because I always had to be the one in charge that took care. That when Papa got very, very sick, I could run it all. I could take care of the stock. I could milk everything. I know how to get the milk ready for the dairy as they came to process the milk. If animals needed shots, we did. When animals needed surgery, we would do minor surgeries on animals all the time. And so it was a good upbringing in the sense that I was on a huge farm, and the nearest neighbors were between 2 and 3 miles away. So the woods were my kingdom. And once I got done with all those chores and got all the bills paid and everything done, then I could play. And so it was an amazing childhood, really, because I had free reign of the whole farm and it was, as we've talked about before, it was a simpler time. Doors were never locked at night. People came and went. It was before the days of you text someone. No, you called or you visited, and when it got dark at night, you went to bed. And I remember when we got the first television, that was a great treat. But even that was limited because you had the work on the farm you had to do. And so you had more to do than you had time to watch television. So the animals came first. And then watching TV was just a pure treat.
What is the funniest thing that has ever happened to you?
You and I have laughed about this before. When I was a junior in high school, the summer before I was it would have been half of my junior year and half of my senior year. I was given a scholarship to study at the University of Grenoble in France. This was the year I arrived in the summer after the Olympics were in Grenoble that February before. And we flew from Charlotte to New York and New York to Heathrow in London, and stayed at London a couple of weeks, just doing all the things that tourist groups do. You know, going on the train up to Windsor and touring the castle and going to Eton, the boys' school, and touring that, and seeing the British Museum. And they didn't let you in Buckingham Palace in those days. You just went to it and saw it, watching the changing of the guard. We did going to Westminster Abbey, all the usual things.
Yeah.
Well, for economics, all the students that were in my group, now there were 3 major groups of students together for that trip. There was a priest and the nuns in that convent and their students, and an all girls school from Bermuda. They were with us. And then there was a group of boys and girls and their chaperones from Connecticut. And then there was the North Carolina, Virginia contingent, of which I was a member. And so they found a reasonable place for all these kids to stay, and it was in a boarding school at Clapham Common on the south side of the Thames River. But the convenient thing about that is it was adjacent to the tube. The subway station was right there, so you could get on that subway and go anywhere, whether it was Paddington Station and then get on a train to go out to in the country to Windsor. You could go where you wanted to go. We even went to Cambridge while we were there. Well, but we'd go back at night and stay at this boarding school, which of course was closed for students because it was summertime. Yeah. They would go, during the school year, and then they would go home for like 3.5 months. Well, I didn't understand the European bathroom system. Even though there was the usual facilities inside my little room, and my best friend from home, who also had a scholarship to go, she was my roommate. She had gone somewhere to take something to someone. She wasn't in the room, so she couldn't let me back in. I thought I had the key in my very short robe, but you had to go out in the hall and down the hall to a shower room, which you locked yourself in the shower room, took the shower, wrapped back up in your robe, and went back to your room. That's just, and there were people roaming around in robes the whole time because everyone staying there had the same accommodations. Well, also there to fill up the school was a bunch of farmers from Cornwall in the southwest of England. Mm-hmm. I locked myself out of my room. I could not get in. I couldn't find anybody to let me in their room. So here I basically have a towel wrapped around me, and I have to go downstairs through the middle of a men's farmers convention, half dressed. That was the singular, most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me, and as a consequence now, I am the most cautious people you've ever known. I hide keys everywhere. I make sure I can get in. Yeah. And I try to keep myself in a position where I'm not going to be caught wrapped in a robe in the middle of a bunch of people.
What is the hardest lesson life has taught you?
I'm going to change this a little bit because I've given some thought on this one. I often will have very, very high expectations. You know that about me. I had that about you when you were little. Trevor, can you remember, were you in first grade when I first had you in the frog program? I think so. And then tutored you intermittently from that time till now. So a long time. Let's suffice it to say a long time. I always had such high, lofty expectations. So what life has taught me is I've had to sometimes adjust that expectation. what I want might not necessarily be what is good for the child, nor might it be what is really good for me in the long run. I've had to make more realistic expectations, and my tendency is to go for perfection, and of course I never achieve it. I don't even come close to it. But I think I have noticed that as every year goes by, and now that I'm 61 heading very rapidly to 62, I realize that some of the things that I wanted just so, they're not truly the important things. That people and family, relationships and God, those are the important things. And whether or not my handwriting was perfect on that paper, in the long scheme of things, that didn't matter. I've learned that I had to adjust my expectations so that life, the important things in life, could be fulfilled. And the other things could be just allowed to go like fluff in the wind. That was a hard lesson because I wanted everything to be equal. It may have a lot to do with the fact that I had so much responsibility as a young child. You know, I couldn't forget to pay a bill for my grandfather because who else was going to do it? I mean, maybe a more than average adult responsibility was put on me at a very young age. For whatever reason, and I've often looked back on this, that maybe if it weren't for that accident, that horrible burning accident, I wouldn't have been in that farm, and they would have been in a very hard place, and it would have put so much more on my mother's sister, who lived about 10 miles away, and she had 4 children of her own. So it worked out beautifully, but I knew from a young age that I had to be a lot more grown up than child. I have enjoyed my grandchild because even though she's the only one I probably will ever have, we play. We have a really good time. And the things that I can fix, I fix. And the things that aren't all that important, I let them fluff like fluff in the wind. I let them go. And I hope I'm teaching that for her. I hope she won't have it quite as hard as I had it. I think maybe that every parent on earth thinks that for their children. They want their children to have it easier, better, simpler than they did. That some of the mistakes that they made won't be revisited. They want them to have an easier go of it. I think that's just human nature.
Yeah. What was the most heartfelt gift anyone has ever given you?
You and I have talked about this before. It was an indirect gift given by your brother Zach. I don't know what grade he was in. It must have been about 3rd. And I had to, after I left here last week, I went home and I looked at it again. I framed it. And I have it in my den, and I guess as long as I live, it'll always hang there. It was a bulletin board. It was on a bulletin board that his teacher had put in the hall. And the project was who's the most influential person that's changed your life? And for Zach, it was me. And he answered this series of questions so beautifully and so eloquently, far beyond his age. But you know, we've talked about this before. Zach is an old soul. Yeah, and I suspect that you may be an old soul too. You were older than your years. I've always sort of felt like the fates, or God, if you want to call it God, put on you and all your siblings a specialness that created this family. And that simple little write-up put on that board, and the teacher, she came and got me. Of course, I was too busy doing my thing. And I would go down that hall, but I would always be in such a rush to get my group and get on, and do my work, that I wouldn't stop and take that in. So when she pointed that out to me, I said, I have to have it. So with Zach's permission, I took it, I framed it, and I look at it periodically because all of us want to think that the choices we've made in life have made a difference. And when I read that, I think for sure in Zach's life and in a lot of other people's lives as well. I hope the fact that I went the path I went to go to school, even though I wanted to be an architect. I went to school to be a teacher because I got that proverbial full ride where I didn't have to pay a thing to get that degree. And so scholarship paid in full. And I think being brought to Valmead was almost heavenly endorsed because I was supposed to be there, and I was supposed to be in a lot of people's lives, including your families, the lives in this family, here in this house, under this roof. That you make a difference. That's what you want to do. I think every teacher feels like they've made an investment in the future with all of their children. You want them to go forth and see. I hope someday I can go to Carnegie Hall and hear you play. I very well may. So, and even if I don't, I'll go to Kaleidoscope and hear you play. And I couldn't be more proud of you from that respect.
Do you believe in karma? And if so, why?
I do. I don't know if I'm an Eastern or spiritual. I think I'm a spiritual person.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's just good common sense, whether you want to call it the golden rule, whatever.
Yeah.
What you pay out will be paid back to you. If you pay out good, good's going to happen to you. You pay out bad, I'm afraid you're going to suffer in the long run. So yes, I think I do believe in karma. I'm not too sure about reincarnation. I've given it a lot of thought. I'm sort of glad you didn't ask that question because I'm not sure about reincarnation.
Yeah.
Even though I think appears to be, and it seems to have come through my mother's side of the family, a tendency to sort of know what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say I was psychic. In fact, I know I wouldn't say that. But there are times that I just know. And it's so keen and so accurate that other people in my life came to believe it and trust it. I know one time a bunch of us were on a wildflower hike. Miss Tutterow, you remember her when she was your principal, your first principal, and Miss Courtney, and myself, Miss Guru, and several others. We were all way out in the country. It was in April, go on a wildflower hike, and all of a sudden, I knew exactly what was going to happen 5 minutes down the road. And I stopped, and I went, here's where we turn back, right now. And we did. And I had no idea if what I thought was correct. I remember Miss Courtney saying, if she says turn around, because sometimes she just knows. My brother one of my two brothers, David, the one nearest to me in age,
Mm-hmm.
he has the same ability. And I think it scares him a little bit. It never scared me as much. I sort of embraced it. It was just what I did. I trust it. I think that more than anything. So, is that part of your spirituality? I don't know. But I think that we all have sort of a sense about us. If we use all of our senses, we can use our brain and increase it so many times more fold than we do. We're bad just to use the minimum and get by the easy way. But the more we read, the more you practice. You've seen it in your practice. You can do amazing things through practice. If you had never practiced, you wouldn't be able to play Pachelbel's canon. But by embracing the things of this earth and the things that are spiritual, I think by those things, good comes of it. And I don't really think you should be afraid. I even wonder if maybe you have the same little gift. I've noticed little glimmers of it in your life before, but yours have been through dreams, and I think you know what I'm talking about. You have dreamed things that you should have known. And I think in my realm, I look at it as a gift that God gave us. That some people just don't have it, and some do have it. And I just pay attention to it whenever I can. So, yes, karma. I think it exists, especially to the sense of doing to others as you would have them doing to you, because then good will come back to you. But the reverse of that might be bad.
If you could spend the day with anyone famous, who would it be and why?
Harvey was the chief historian in charge of antiquities in Egypt. I would like to spend the day with him in any Egyptian archaeological site that he would like to choose. I would go to the Valley of the Gods, to the Giza Plateau, wherever he would want to go. I think that he is brilliant. I think he's a difficult man. I've learned since I've been in the last couple of years that he's a hard fellow to be around, but I think he's a brilliant fellow to be around, and I would like to spend some time with him and see what he sees through his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
As just being a pure historian, I would love to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Of the living. Now that's a living person. If I could pick a dead person, it would be my 9th great grandfather, William Parker. I would like to. I have a series of questions to ask that man, and I have a cousin who's has written about 54 books on the family genealogy. And I asked her the same question. I said, if you could speak to William Parker, who is like her 7th great grandfather, what would you ask him? And it's funny, we had about the same questions. It was those things, those answers that you can't prove. With courthouses that have burned over the years or been destroyed by wars or being burned in war. You just can't get answers to questions. Like, we don't know his wife's name. Yeah. We don't know why he got Dumpling Island as his 50 acres after he did his indentured servitude with the John Bush family. Just huge questions. Who did you marry? Did you live on Dumpling Island or did you live up Oyster House Creek? Was Ray, the cousin that wrote the ancestry books,
mm-hmm.
What she found out about you, was it right? I asked Ray, and she said, the big question I would ask him is, what I discovered, are you proud of me for doing it? And was I right? Mm-hmm. And what was wrong, if anything? So, yes, I would head to Egypt in life. I would head to the Nansemond River in the Virginia colony in death, somebody in death.
Mm-hmm. What do you want your epitaph to say?
I tried very hard all my life. I gave it more than just a tenacious effort. And I think that was a really good skill to have to be a teacher anyway, because you're never going to give up on anybody. And if something doesn't work, you try something else. Mm-hmm. It's what teachers do.
Yeah. What made you decide that you wanted to become a teacher?
Necessity. I could only get about half of my education paid for if I'd gone towards architecture. Mm-hmm. I knew I either wanted to work doing something in history or something in some building, some construction trade, and applied to probably more schools. It's not as expensive as it is today, because my little niece has just finished the process. I think she applied to 10 different colleges and universities before she picked the University of Pennsylvania. But I wanted to go to William and Mary for all the obvious reasons. We've talked about it before. All the 4 branches of my family, the Parkers and the Miltons, the Hesters, and the Branch family. Mm-hmm. Those 4 lines all started between 1616 and 1642 in the Virginia colony. So what did I want to do? William and Mary, right in the middle of that. That's where I wanted to go. But out-of-state tuition, extremely expensive, unworkable with a grandfather who was dying. So it was I knew I wouldn't mind teaching. I think it was a surprise for me that I liked it as much as I did. Because I still would rather, I'll sit down and I'll doodle and I'll do my sketches and I can plan you a lovely house. That was my first love. But teaching sort of came to me almost as if it were a gift. Here, if you take this scholarship, you can be a teacher, and it won't put any sort of a financial burden on a family that was stressed with financial burdens, with a grandfather who had had numerous surgeries, horrible surgeries near the end. He pretty much battled lung cancer from the time I was in second grade until I was in the end of March my senior year in undergraduate school. So what would that be? 16. That's 14 years. For 14 years, he battled that. And my poor grandmother was left with a lot of those bills. Even though he had good insurance, it's still, like it is today, it's expensive. And coinciding about that time, the American farm was not as productive or lucrative as it was before. It became expensive to run a farm, especially a farm basically run by a little child, which is what happened. They would do all they could to help me, and he would stand at my side and tell me I was right or wrong. But it made a huge close relationship between my grandmother and grandfather and myself. There's not a day that doesn't go by that I wish they were here. I wish they knew Stella.
Yeah.
Maybe they do.
Yeah.
Maybe they're with us right now.
Yeah.
I hope, and then they can rejoice when something goes right, and they can kind of pinch at us when we do something really wrong that we probably shouldn't be doing, or get stubborn, or have too much temper, or lose your temper outright, which we all do at times. Of course, we strive not to, but we still do it more than we want to.
If you could ask God one question, what would it be?
That was and still is and probably will continue to be the hardest of the questions of all. Why did we have to be so tenaciously stubborn? We rail and rant and think we know all the answers, and in reality we really don't. We know what's best for us to an extent, but even that's questionable. So I would ask him, why could we have not, as the human race, could we have been made a little less stubborn and a little more malleable to his will? But maybe that was his plan all along. He wanted us to have to fight it the hard way, because we know that when we learn through our mistakes. Think about any piece of music you pick up. You learn more from the mistakes you make in playing it than if it were just perfectly done. Yeah. You try something, it works, it doesn't work. You keep at it, and you keep perfecting it, and you keep practicing, and you keep ruminating on it. And if you're like I am, sometimes you'll sit and think, okay, is there anything else I need to add to that? And so, yeah, you have to, you just have to keep plugging away, I guess.
If you could spend another hour with your father, what would you say to him?
I would sit down with him. I had two people. I would pick Papa, and I would pick Daddy. And I've thought about this some as well, and I think that he was always very cautious about what he told me about World War II. I was a grown woman married to Richard before he ever really told me anything, and he didn't want me even to read books about Pearl Harbor or any of the places that he was. He was, bless his heart, he had some bad luck in the sense that he was at Pearl Harbor during the bombing on the New Orleans. He was knocked unconscious off the ship into the water. Probably would not be alive today were it not for the fact that it was a Sunday, and Sunday was the one day you could take a bagged lunch up to the deck of the ship. And it was, I know this because he would never eat these things. To the day he died, he never ate boiled eggs, oranges, or toast. That was what was in that bag that day, Trevor. And it left him with a horrible, well, Granny would say he was foundered off of them. He never wanted that again. He was up. I don't know if you remember exactly how Pearl Harbor was laid out, but the major battleships like the Arizona, the ships came in perpendicular to them. The first planes came in perpendicular to the large battleships. Cruisers, few of them were in there. Most of the aircraft carriers were out to sea, luckily. Or who knows what language we'd be speaking now, possibly Japanese. But they were parked this way, and over to the east side of Pearl Harbor, opposite Ford Island, which was here, there were small cruisers lined up the same way as the battleships. So when the planes came in, he was sitting there looking that way, and here come, at first it looked just like something glinting in the sky. Then he realized there were planes coming right at him. And they had been told that day, they'd been told before this, that there would not be any battle station drills on a Sunday. So at first, when they called battle stations, nobody paid any attention because they thought that it was just an accident. And then pretty soon, it didn't take long to realize that they were being shot at. And because he was there, now he was a gunner's mate at that time, and the gunner was killed by a shot. And Daddy, who really didn't know much about how to shoot the gun, took over and tried to do all he could. But because he was on the deck, he was knocked off by an explosion into the water, which of course was on fire. Oil floating on the top of the water and burning. The next morning, he was picked up. He had floated with the current back towards the backside of Ford Island, and he had burns all over him. But he survived. His good friend from childhood, who was he didn't know he was on the same assignment. He didn't live that day. He was up there with Daddy. He was having breakfast with Daddy, the bagged lunch deal, and Daddy was able to hold on to him. So when they got Daddy the next day, he was dehydrated and burned all over and in shock and in and out of comas. But he survived it. And from the next assignment he was put on was the Yorktown, which was not a good place to be either because it got shot up pretty badly at the Battle of Midway. And then eventually he was on the Minneapolis. That was not a good ship to be on either. So he kept getting on these horrible ships, but he made it all the way to the end. He was off of Tokyo when Nagasaki and Hiroshima, when the bombs blew. He made it the whole time, but it left scars on him that were just horrendous scars. So I would he never would tell me much because of those scars. Before Seth was born and long after I was married to Richard, we sat up one night all night long, and he told me about the battles. And I was mortified, and I could see then he was very graphic about it. But if I could have him come back, I would ask him more questions along the same lines. I would want to know more about it. And the other person I would bring back to ask to talk to would be my grandfather, Papa, the one that raised me. And mine is not so much to ask him, but to show him what I found out in his genealogy, things he did not know about. He was one of those people that deported themselves in a very princely way. He was special. Everybody knew he was special. There was no question about it. He was just purely special. And as I did his genealogy, and it was really easy to do. His was traceable. A lot of that's luck. You know, if the courthouse is standing and not been burned, then records are probably there, so you can follow the paper trail. And his paper trail is easy to go back through the churches they belong to. That's a simple paper trail. But if you go back through his line, you get to the Plantagenet Kings of England. And the first day I found that, when I went the back door through to Alfred the Great, and I thought, it doesn't shock me that there was royal blood in him, because he acted like a prince. He was amazing. He's someone I wish you had known. I wish Richard had known him. He died in the last day of March, and I met Richard that November after that. So he never knew him either. But I would want to see him again to tell him what I found out, and I'm hoping he knows it already. I'm hoping that he's looking over my shoulder the whole time and knows that he had royal blood coursing through him. And then with Daddy, I would want to know more about the war.
What was the most valuable advice that you received from your mother?
Be honest. I mean, that's... Because if you're honest, even honest to yourself, then a lot of other things follow, like punctuality and kindness, goodness, virtue, and hard work. Those things all go together. So, it's born out of honesty, I think. And to this day, I have a really hard time when I catch somebody in a lie. I don't deal. You know that about me. I don't deal well with lies, and because I'm thinking to be honest is something very simple you can do. You can make a mistake. It's okay. You take your punishment. You get on with it. But you need to be honest about what you did, because then to thine own self be true. You've done what's right in the eyes of your own self, your own soul.
If you could go back and change something in your life, would you?
Well, if there had been money there, I would have liked to have tried a degree in design and architecture. I would have been a great architect, I think. I think I might have been a better architect than a teacher even. But here's the problem. That is one of those dog-eat-dog worlds that in those days was not as easy for a woman. It was easier for a man to get there. More doors open for men than women. And at the time I would have become an architect. It would have been hard. So ultimately, the world of teaching might have been better for my place in time, for me in my place in time. But yeah, I think I would have liked to have tried that to see. I've had several doctors tell me I should have been a doctor. But I don't know if you remember in the Little Women books, but when they asked Jo March something about what she did for a living, she was a writer. And they said, well, you should have been this and that. And she said, I should have been a great many things. And so I think all of us are sort of that way. I think you're torn that way. You're torn towards you like law enforcement, that area, but you also like the music. And then you like the things spiritual. So it's going to be interesting for me. I hope I live long enough to see which way you and your siblings go, which way you finally decide which road you go down. Which one will you choose? Or can you do more than one of them? I don't know.
What is the best thing that has ever happened to you?
Marrying Richard and adopting Seth and Stella coming. So family. Yeah. The best thing is family. I'm feeling it now because in this last week, since I've been here, my mother only had one sister that survived childhood and babyhood. And she still is alive, but she's very ill. She's rather old. And in the last few years, well, I think about 9 years ago, she was reacquainted with a childhood sweetheart. And they ended up marrying late in life, in their 70s. And just in this last week since I've been here, we've discovered that he has 3 to 9 months to live. And it's hard because it's when she grieves, then I grieve. You hurt for other people that you love. And I see this, it's just been an incredibly hard week. And I think it's kept me from sleeping right. And because I know the next couple of months are going to be hard. Hospice was called in today. These are you know yourself from your family members that have passed. It's not easy. There's no easy way around it. Time does make it a little bit better, but I think we're going to have a hard. This next year might have its own challenges.
Yeah.
So knowing how much family is important to me, I think it's going to be Papa would say, a hard row to hoe.
How has Stella Ruth changed your life?
Oh, I used to be a clean housekeeper and very neat and very organized and just so. And now we just have tea parties, play, read, run, and pretend, make up random languages and sing crazy songs and pretend that we're different people. It's all about play. So I've stopped being half so serious and so much like, I think maybe when my uncle said go forth and have a childhood, my true childhood has been playing with Stella. Because I become like a little child myself.
What are some major events that have happened in your life?
Well, I guess if you went through chronologically, I would say being burned in the fire and almost dying. Sort of separated from my family as an aftermath of that. That was a major event because, I wasn't raised with my brothers, even though now one of those 2 brothers is extremely close to me. But it wasn't always that way. When we were younger, we lived in 2 different places. But the youngest brother, he just doesn't know me. We get along, and when we see each other, we have fun, but we're not as close. So the fire, the being rerouted to a different place in the geography of the world, and then teaching as a career being kind of plopped in my lap as a gift. And I think it was a gift. Then meeting Richard, not having any children, but then the opportunity to adopt Seth and be a mother, that was amazing and so very, very powerful. And then when Seth and Jenny were told they could never have any children because she had to have the liver transplant, then all of a sudden she's pregnant. It almost killed her to have that baby. Her health is horrible now because of having that baby. But like my aunt and I were talking the other day, we have that baby. Stella's amazing. So it's all of those things are the lights of your life as time goes by. And they seem to just get better, which is great. It's either they're better or we appreciate it more, that we focus on it more and appreciate it more. But I try not to take anybody for granted. I try to take it all as just being a gift. So I don't know what else I could add to that.
How was school for you when you were younger?
Well, not having any siblings living with me and so many responsibilities that my grandmother and grandfather had and so many I had to help on the farm, I had to be the one that made me do my homework, the one that double checked everything. It made me very cautious. I would do the things that I liked better, the reading and the history, that came easily. The things I liked less, the math and the science, I had to work at. But it made me a self-starter So now I don't wait to the last second to do anything. I know a lot of kids will do that. You've seen them, and you've probably done it some yourself. You'll think, oh, there's a project due tomorrow. Let's start it the night before. That's not me. I'm very conscientious, and I want it just right, or as right as I can make it. So I think because I was by myself in my own little kingdom, I would read speeches and papers I'd written to the pigs. They were captive inside the four walls of their fence. So I could sit there on the livestock loading ramp, and they would sit there and just listen to me like they understood everything I was saying. So you could talk to the cows while you were milking them. You could do your multiplication tables while you fed the mules. You could help plow a field and recite some poem that we had to learn to recite from rote. So I guess I became my own teacher and my own mother and my own tutor. Had to. There wasn't anybody else to do it.
What was the first job you ever had?
I worked in my Uncle Jesse Hare's dry cleaner, and he had the good sense, instead of thinking, oh, she's family, let's give her a cushy job, he gave me the worst job in the entire place, which was down in the bowels of the building in the shirt laundry and the sheet laundry, the flat laundry. It was hot. Hades, I don't think, could be any hotter. And I had to literally work my way upstairs to be a clerk, checking in people's dry cleaning and laundry when they would drop it by. So he had the good sense to make me earn the right to work up in the easier job, the hard way. I don't think hard work ever hurt anyone, or very few anyway, doing it the hard way. So yeah, he gave me my first job.
What would you say to people before you leave
this world? Keep trucking on. Keep trying hard and doing your best. And don't take anybody for granted. And think before you speak, because words can be so hurtful. Your first temptation would be to have a sharp tongue and say some horrible, hateful thing. But most of the time, it's not in your heart. What you've said is not what you mean. So your best thing is to carefully weigh your words, think about it before you speak, and when you do speak, try to do something helpful and productive, not destructive and harmful.
What was your first car?
Papa got me a huge Fury. It weighed a ton, and we've joked about it before. I don't think a Sherman tank could have been much harder. It had a lovely, the gas mileage on it was something like 4 miles to the gallon. It just guzzled the stuff, and it would literally shake as it rode down the road. It was huge. It was ugly. It was the ugliest color of gold you could ever imagine on earth. But it was reliable, and it was tough. So I could, it would take a full tank of gas to get it to go to get from home, from the farm to Boone on the way back to school.
Yeah. What was your favorite quote? What's been your favorite quote?
And I've tried to live by it. D.H. Lawrence, the English writer, said, "It is only immoral to be dead alive, sun extinct, and busy putting out the sun in other people." So dead alive, you've known people like that. People that were living, breathing, but there was no joy in them. Sun extinct. I mean, the sun's died out so long in them that they're hard and cold and difficult. And maybe the most important, the last part, and people who, it's immoral, it's against the laws of God and man to be busy putting out the sun in other people. In other words, to be malicious, gossip, rumor, do anything you can to hurt other people. I remember when I read that, it was so powerful to me that I thought everybody should live this way. And I guess you also can draw correlations between that and the Bible, because the Bible preaches the same basic thing, that you shouldn't do those things. But I think life is a gift, and I think so much of the time we take it for granted. Once in a while, someone in my life I will hear that they have committed suicide. And I never have ever understood that, the desperation they must have felt to make them do such a thing. But I also want to live. I want to live. I want to be healthy. And I want to see you grow up the rest of the way. I want to see Stella married and on gone in a life that she's loving.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's a good way to live. Doing good instead of bad. If you could do, I don't always live up to my own lofty expectation, but I try. See, there again, I tried.
Yeah.
I think I tried.
Which president was your favorite?
But no question about it, Thomas Jefferson, brilliant. Somewhere in that gene pool, even though, if you go back, his great-grandmother was a child of Christopher Branch. And if you go through my Granny Hester's people, you go right back to Christopher Branch, who was like 2 years old when he came across the boat to the Virginia colony in like 1618, 1619, something like that. Jefferson was brilliant. Obviously the brilliance came through. I don't think I got that brilliant gene, but I admire him all the same. I think he was such a Renaissance man. He understood so much. I don't know how gentle and tender a person he was, though. That part I wouldn't like of him. I've read a lot of books about it, and I think he gets into his own little world sometimes, and especially how he dealt with his children. He would expect them to sit at his feet, but he didn't really want them talking to him much because he was stuck in a book. He used his mind brilliantly. We give him full credit for that. I don't think he was understood in his life as much as he was understood and appreciated after his life. Think Mozart.
Yeah.
Not at all appreciated, very little appreciated in his life. But later, now we look back on him and go, how could he have lived, and especially died, the way he did, a pauper? Today, Mozart, if he lived, would be so famous in his own time. Before his death, he was only after his death, posthumously, that's when we understood his brilliance. But yeah, the presidents, it would definitely be Jefferson, and I guess a close second would be Teddy Roosevelt, because of the sheer amount of things he did during his presidency. Different, unique things. A lot of them have changed life as we know it today.
Yeah. And last question. If you could go anywhere in the whole wide world, where would you go?
Peru. I always had a desire to walk the Inca Trail, and I would like to, and of course that altitude is just, the elevation is so high that you could even have effects of altitude sickness. Mm-hmm. You have to go and fly into Cusco and then acclimate yourself for 7 days or so, and then you go a little higher and you acclimate yourself there, going from base camp to base camp. Mm-hmm. But I always wanted to be able to hike, to take the train towards Machu Picchu village, Pueblo, and get off and walk the Inca Road and approach Machu Picchu as the sun came up. That was always a dream of mine. Don't think I'll ever get that done. I might end up in Peru, but I would be more in tourist mode than carrying 40 pounds of food and clothes on my back.
Yeah.
But I would like to have been able to do that. That would have been great.
And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.